In the harsh wilderness with biting winds, Lelia and her werewolf mate Lev cling to each other for survival. How do they endure the trials of nature together? Welcome to the Alpha's Love channel. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Chapter 6. Lelia was lucky her mate was the warmest thing she'd ever felt. Truly. It was almost uncomfortable, leaning towards hot, yet it wasn't keeping her completely warm. The wind harshly blowing across her back was enough for her whole body to erupt in shudders. Her mate stopped in concern, but she urged him to continue. Lelia just wanted to be somewhere warm. She only lasted about 20 minutes more. Her legs began to shake first, and she dealt with it, but Lelia had to tap her mate's head to stop him when her hands shook beyond control. As his large body lowered to the ground to allow her to get off, she noticed she could see her breath in front of her. Lelia's legs gave out with a loud, wheezing cough. Her mate was immediately by her side. He nudged her body softly to get her attention and let out a loud yelp when she fell to the ground. She curled in on herself to gather as much warmth as possible. It wasn't working. She weakly reached for her mate with a shaking hand. There was no hesitation from him when he wrapped his furry body around hers for warmth. Her shivers stopped a minute later, but her hands continued to shake. The male grunted and tried to find a way for them to continue. This would have to be the place they stopped for the night. He had been trained not to sleep, so he had no problem keeping his eyes trained on their surroundings. He would die before his mate was hurt, and he knew it was practically impossible to kill him. He hadn't been trained to die. It wouldn't be happening. A small grunt, then a whimper from his mate had his attention immediately on her. The shivers had begun again. The large wolf flicked the tiny human's arms to warm her up. His head rubbed against her body until the shivers stopped again. He lost track of how long the shivers started and stopped. Lelia woke with a small shiver, then jumped as her arm received a long like from a rough, scratchy tongue. Her eyes drifted towards her mate and she smiled. The wolf didn't notice she had awoken, so she silently watched as he groomed his mate. "Thank you," she murmured. Her mate startled and stood with a growl. His lips curled then dropped back to their normal state once Lelia let the giggle slip past her lips. He huffed to paced in circles around her until she got dizzy watching him. How much longer? Lelia questioned. She blushed and looked towards the ground with the realization that he wouldn't be able to answer her. His paw lightly touched her side, then pointed to himself. What about you?" She wondered aloud. Lelia really wished he would shift back, because she was beginning to feel dumb with the way she had to guess what he was trying to say. He brushed her hair roughly with his paw and pointed towards himself again. "Me, my hair. Why did you tuff my hair?" She just felt worse and worse with each guess. It was clear her mate was getting frustrated with each wrong answer. He did the same thing as before, and now Lelia could feel her frustration growing as well. I'm just going to shift so I can warm up a little before we take off," she said defeatedly. She looked up at her mate to ask him to turn around, only to find him jumping in circles around her. His tongue was hanging out of the side of his mouth and his eyes were light with happiness. "No way," she shouted. That was it the whole time. His head nodded quickly and she tried to stand up quickly to hold him, only to fall back down. His paw reached out to hold her before she hit the ground. Lelia gave him a thankful smile. Once she was able to stand, her mate released her and turned around to give her privacy. She slipped off her dress and quickly shifted into her wolf. The fur was quick to warm her a little, but her small paws still shook. Lelia made a small noise to gather her mate's attention, and she could tell he had something on his mind when he turned around. His teeth delicately picked up her dress and wrapped his mate in it. Soon she was almost completely swathed in the white fabric. Her paws were tucked close to her body and the clothes surrounding her allowed her body to become warmer until she stopped shaking. Lelia went lowly in hopes her mate would understand her grateful news. He nodded his head slightly and picked her up with his teeth before darting further into the foliage. The cloth surrounding Lydia took the brunt of the wind, and they were able to run for hours until her stomach growled loudly. She found it incredible that her mate was not out of breath at all after running for that long. She tried not to think of his past and where he came from, but knew it would be the only thing on her mind in the next few days. The incredibly large wolf walked for a few more minutes before setting Lydia down at the bottom of a tree trunk. There were long, red flowers with a strong scent surrounding her. Her mate nudged the plant so they covered his mate in their scent. Then he was off. She wanted to find food for herself, but knew her body was in no condition to do so. She'd also had no training and had no clue how to defend herself should something happen. Lydia groomed her fur while she waited for her mate to come back with food. Hopefully another rabbit. They had become her favorite food. Her licking ceased when the sound of multiple wolves filled her ears. She couldn't tell if one of them was her mate, but gathering that there were multiple wolves, she guessed he wasn't one of them. Her mate didn't seem like the type to get along with others. She kept quiet, thanking the moon goddess her mate had hidden her well. Relief and a tiny, unwanted bit of arousal flooded through her. She prayed they couldn't smell it. The strong scent of the flowers did well in hiding her, but they were very strong. The longer she laid there, the more it began to stick in her nose. Lydia's nostrils burned with the need to sneeze, but she managed to hold it back. For a few seconds, she decided it was the loudest sneeze she'd ever had, but that might have been because of the quietness of the clearing. Lydia heard every single paw freeze, then growls erupt from deep in their throats. Her body quaking in fear, she still tried to remain as silent as possible. Though she had made a noise, the flowers covering her should still be enough for her scent to be completely covered. The wolves crept towards her, with growls loud enough to make her want to cover her ears, but she couldn't. Lydia could not give away her position at all. A growl overtook the others, as Lydia heard pounding footsteps enter the clearing. She could barely see through the flowers, but was trying to focus on the new wolf. He slightly turned the right way, causing his fur to glint off of the light, and Lydia almost barked happily. It was her mate. When he leapt towards one of the wolves, Lydia closed her eyes. She didn't want to see what was going to happen next. The sound of flesh being ripped off of the bone caused her to also close her ears. It only took a few minutes for her mate to finish what the wolves had started. His large paw brushed the flowers out of the way, then touched his mate softly. She jumped into the air with a squeal and didn't even look to it touched her before curling into a little ball. Lydia's mate let out a little chuff that sounded oddly like laughter. Her paws uncovered her face and she jumped on top of her mate. He allowed her to climb all over his face and body like a pup for a few moments before using one of his paws to lightly pick her up and put her on the ground. Her mate had saved her. Again. The feeling would never get old. He set her on her dress again, watching her squirm to get comfortable. Then he turned around and jogged to the rabbits he had left laying on the ground. He dropped them in front of Lydia and nudged them towards her. She picked up two for herself and pushed the other back towards him. He pushed one back to her with a whine, but she knew her stomach wouldn't be able to handle 3 rabbits. She pushed it back. He took the 4 rabbits in his mouth with a huff. Slowly his body wound around hers until it was shielding her from the outside world. She ate in the warmth radiating off of her mate and didn't think she had felt happier than that in her entire life. She'd just been living until she met him, but now it felt like she had a purpose. His rabbits were gone before hers were. He waited patiently for his mate to finish before standing and beginning to swathe her in the white dress once more. A few moments later, they were off. Though she was comfortable now, she wondered how much longer, until her mate had to run before they reached his land. Fear consumed her mind as the dress bounced back and forth in her mate's mouth. Would they refuse to let her on their land? Would they torture her, thinking she was a spy? Lydia just wanted her mate. If she had him, she could get through anything. Chapter 7. They spent another night in the wilderness. Lelia didn't shift this time because she needed all the warmth she could get. She didn't particularly want to get sick with no doctors around. Her mate didn't exactly know of her condition. He found a small cave for them and once again set her down behind a few rocks to go hunt. She shivered and burrowed more into her dress, that wasn't so white anymore. Dirtied a little bit of red water like polka dots on the fabric. When she spotted her mate again, he was carrying both the deer and 2 rabbits in his mouth. They ate quickly, and faster than her, and he nudged the second rabbit towards her when she was finished with her first one. She shook her head and he reluctantly wolfed down what she hadn't eaten. They left again at dawn. She hadn't slept much that night, and noticed her mate hadn't either. Had he slept at all the past few nights, she wished he could talk to her. She was surprised when a few hours past noon a horrible stench filled her nose. Lilia's mate seemed unaffected, but she couldn't say the same about herself. She sneezed once and then gagged a few moments later. Her mate, sensing her distress, set her down on the ground. His nose pushed her body all over the place, looking for the reason she had been upset earlier. She gagged again, and all her mate could do was nudge her and whine. Lilia's throat felt like it was closing. She looked at her mate with wide eyes, worried it would affect him too. Wide eyes were reflected back at her as the whines continued. He rolled her onto her side and laid atop her to keep watch on the surroundings. It was all he could do, and he couldn't help the whines of guilt that escaped him. She calmed down hours later and half that suggested they get going. She tried to stand but her body collapsed immediately. Lilia's legs felt like she had run across the continent. Her mate stuck his head under her stomach and lifted her up only to place her back on her old, tattered white dress. He wrapped it around her, and they were off again. She stuck her nose deep into the fabric to try and block the smell, but it was no use. She still couldn't figure out why her mate wasn't affected. Her ears perked up at the sound of metal hitting metal. Her mate didn't seem too bothered by it, though she didn't think she should be scared, but she was extremely curious as to what was making that sound. Her questions were answered a few moments later. The grass began to thin until they were walking on dirt before the trees opened up into a clearing. She squinted her eyes at the bright lights that turned on as soon as their presence was detected. Her mate stopped and calmly laid on the ground. He tucked her underneath his chin as she heard a door open in the distance. She couldn't see anything past the bright lights. Lilia flinched when footsteps of about 50 wolves neared her and her mate. She wondered why her mate was so calm all of a sudden. It didn't seem like he was going to jump to protect her should something happen. Her heart dropped. They got closer and closer and Lilia got so scared she let out a loud yelp. The wolves stopped in their tracks, and she could hear them trying to scent who the intruders were. One of them let out a howl and some of the wolves retreated. A few minutes passed until another set of footsteps neared them. Her mate stood above her abruptly, leaving her sprawled on the ground. She felt bare once she'd been unwrapped from the dress, leaving her fur for all to see. She scurried behind one of her mate's large, thick paws. While it didn't hide her completely from view, her whole body wasn't seen by the approaching male. Someone shouted and the footsteps became hurried. Lilia peeked her head around her mate's legs to see a tall, slim man standing in front of them. She rushed to hide again as her mate bowed his front to the ground. What was happening? Was this where he lived? The front of his body rose back off of the ground and she scurried back to her hiding spot. Lev. I smell another being with you. Lev, bring them out, the man commanded. His voice was rough and demanding, 2 things that were the complete opposite of Lilia. She shivered. Her mate seemed to be going through an internal battle, growling first before lifting his paw away from a hiding spot. She yelped and scurried behind his other paw to hide, but he lifted that one a second later. She felt helpless. A pup? Why do you have a pup with you? Lev, who had a pup? Who was Lev? Grab the pup. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing enthusiasm. The man commanded. One of the larger wolves made his way towards them, but stopped at the sound of her mate's growl. Was she the pup? Why were they coming after her? What was this play? Indiaism, land down. The man commanded. Lev snarled at him. The man gave Lev. Then Lee a confused glance. A few moments later it looked like he'd solved whatever problem he had and took a step back. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing enthusiasm. Back up until you reach me. Don't even look at them, the strange man said, and shift back once you are behind me. Oscar followed his orders until he shifted into a nude man about 20 feet away. She whimpered and covered her eyes. Liv quietly moved his paw back in front of her and softly growled as a warning to the two men in front of them. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nogan. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing enthusiasm. Run as fast as you can to the Beta's main room, and tell him Lev is back and he's found his mate. Oscar gasped and turned immediately. Lev didn't miss the look of fear on his face before he began to run away. What was a mate? Lilia whimpered from behind his paw. She was scared of this man that somehow had control over her mate. Was he Lev's alpha? He sounded so mean. Lev, drop her off in your den and come meet me in room 22. Do it quickly, he ordered Lev. Her mate picked her up by the nape of her neck and jogged past the man. Lily tried to keep her eyes clenched shut, but they unconsciously opened and she made eye contact with the strange man as they passed him. She then deemed him evil in her mind. They walked into the large compound, tossing many guards both human and wolf. The humans held the largest guns she'd ever seen, and the wolves had so much muscle she didn't even know it was possible. Nobody looked at them as they entered. She wondered just how much power her mate had when it came to his home. The compound was full of rooms with grass flooring, and when she glanced into each room, all she saw was several caves or large hills with large holes dug out of them, and wolves sleeping in them. She only grew more confused. What exactly was this place? Liv led her into one of the many archways of the compound and into a large cave. Every time she thought the cave would end, a new pathway would appear. The other caves and hills she'd seen were just large enough for the wolf to fit in, but Lev seemed to go on forever. He finally stopped near at the back corner of the cave and gently set her down. They'd left her dress outside the border of the compound, and the cave had the same temperature as the caves they'd hidden in on the way to his pack. This was strange land, and it was full of strange people. Lev nuzzled her stomach before stepping backwards and turning around to leave. She shouldn't tell him she was cold. He would be late to meet that scary man if he turned around, so he doesn't need to know. She'll get through it. She could do this. Lilia didn't account for just how long he would be gone. She was sure it was dark outside by now, because it felt like he'd been gone for about 4 hours. Her body started shaking on the first hour. Uncontrollable whimpering started during the second hour, and she didn't really remember the third hour. Her eyesight was getting fuzzy was the only thing she really knew. The ground in front of her was blurry, and she was kicking herself mentally for being like this. Why couldn't she be like a normal wolf? She could die staying here like this because she was a weak wolf that couldn't be one her own. She felt ashamed of herself and began to wish she was back with her old alpha rather than dying right here. She blinked in surprise when she felt something nuzzle under her neck and a loud noise through her left ear. Her body was numb. How could she feel this person's touch? She was tired, really tired. She shouldn't have done this. She made a mistake. Lilia wants to go back to her mom. And her home. She wants to go back to being safe. Chapter 8. Lev didn't understand at all what he had to do with the little wolf. Screams of the lives he'd taken away constantly floated around his mind, and they'd gone on for so long he couldn't remember what silence sounded like. When he was even near her, instantly. Lev was always taught control, and never once had it broken. He always had control over himself, despite being 90% wolf. He was told he had a human side, but had yet to see it. He lost control the moment he saw her. Why? He couldn't figure it out. Lev was waiting for the idiotic man to let him out of the cage before he attacked. It was fun to surprise a coward. He knew he had to get back to his pack quickly, or Roman would be mad. Lev hadn't had a punishment in a while. When he made eye contact with her through the bars of the cage, something in him snapped. It felt like he'd been kicked so hard it knocked all of the air out of his body, but in the best way possible. Did that even make sense? He couldn't decide. It wasn't difficult to escape the cage, especially when that asshole had his hands on her. Then it was over. That man was lucky he wasn't dead. Lev just wanted to figure out what was going on. He wanted to know why he needed this girl. Needed to protect her. Watch her. Take care of her. He really didn't know. He disliked it at first. His mate was a small thing, weak, tired, and always cold. Her skin would be freezing when he touched it, but she could only communicate in her human form. He felt bad he couldn't really do anything to make her warmer. By the end of their journey, his protectiveness had turned into a different emotion. He didn't know what it was, and it just added to his list of frustrations. Arriving at his pack was a happy moment for him until Roman arrived. He had never seen Roman act anything but put powerful all his life. When he saw the man looking scared as the little wolf tripped over herself, he wanted to hide her beneath him again. Why was he scared of her? To my agent extraordinaire, Madame Nogan, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Roman's second in command was also surprised to see Ev had another wolf with him. Neither of them bothered to hide their shock or fear, but apparently they looked intimidating to the little wolf. She was shaking before he'd even brought her inside. She hung limply from his mouth, simply looking at all of the warriors inside their dens. Lev felt a burst of pride at the thought as in. Because he was the best warrior in the pack, he got the best den. It was so large that it took over a minute to reach the very inside depths of the cave. He carefully set her down on the floor and watched her curl up into a little ball, her clothing forgotten outside the compound. Someone had probably burned it to get rid of the scent. He nudged her with his nose to assure he'd be back and then left the den to head towards room 22. It was a large room with grass flooring, beige walls, and there was usually a lot of wolves. Sometimes the whole pack could fit in there, but that was only for the most important announcements. They were all there and waiting for him when he arrived, and while he was wondering why they were all there, they all began to walk past him and out of the room. What was going on? Lev, get in here, Roman commanded him. Lev complied with the orders immediately and sat patiently in front of him. Roman sat on his big red chair that signaled his position in the pack. Do you know why you're here? Lev simply shook his head. Do you know what a mate is? Lev shook his head. He had never heard that word before. Do you have any feelings towards the wolf? Lev cocked his head in confusion. Never mind this meeting, Lev. Tomorrow I'd like you to complete the training you missed while you were gone. Understood? Roman asked. Lev nodded. Dismissed. Lev trotted back to his den. He wanted to get back to the little wolf quickly and he just wished he could understand why. When he got back, he howled in a way he never had before. The little wolf was on the ground shaking so much he would have thought it was having an earthquake. When he nudged her, she wouldn't open her eyes. What was wrong? What was going on? He soon heard footsteps run into the room and gasp. Lev turned around to see Roman. a few other men, and their doctor. Lev snarled when he noticed how close they were to the wolf. Roman motioned for everyone to take a step back. Lev, choose hypothermia, Roman said in the gentlest voice Lev had ever heard. Each one of them understood that when it came to Lev's mate, they would all lose against him. She was probably out in the elements too long and your den is too cold for her. We need to help her before she dies. Lev this time Lev snarled and took a step towards him. They took another step back. Lev, this is up to you. You can either let us help her, or she dies. Roman shouted. He couldn't even imagine what Lev would do if the small wolf died. It was the first time Roman had been scared his entire life. Lev looked between his mate and his pack. He then curled around her and nodded for them to come forward. He snarled when they all moved. Lev only wanted the doctor. Understanding the message, the doctor slowly made his way to the little wolf. Lev rumbled his chest so the doctor would understand not to make any sudden moves. Sir, he addressed Roman. We'll have to move her. What should we do? Explain it to him. Roman told him. The doctor cleared his throat. Lev, we need to move her to the medical den. You can carry her, but we need to move now, the man mumbled. He scrambled backwards when Lev stood, his chest still rumbling. He picked her up by the back of her neck and nudged the doctor towards the door. Everyone raced down the hall, Lev's large paws thumping ahead of them. The doctor skidded into a small room and motioned for Lev to lay her on the bed. Strange people tried to enter the room, but Lev's growl stopped them. They fidgeted at the door, unsure of what to do. Those are the nurses. They're here to help, the doctor begged. The nurses quietly entered the room and got to work. Lev kept his nose touching some part of her body at all times. They weren't going to take her away from him. He didn't know why he was feeling like this, but at this exact moment he didn't care. Her life was on the line. He could hear the doctor giving orders to the nurses, but he tuned them out. Lev's ears focused on the sound of her heartbeat. He would make sure it never stopped. 2 hours later and everyone had left except the doctor. He wiped the sweat off his brow and motioned his hand to Lev tiredly. Wrap her in your wolf form, Lev, and she should be awake by tomorrow. Without hesitation, Lev jumped on the bed next to the little wolf. The doctor winced when the bed creaked under Lev's weight, but didn't say anything on his way out of the room. Just being in the same room as Lev felt like his life was at risk. Lev was genuinely surprised when the little wolf woke up tomorrow morning. He knew she was small and got sick easily, so he had predicted another day before she woke up. He carefully waited to see what she would do, and felt a pleased feeling run through him when she just burrowed deeper into his fur. He could ask questions later. Chapter 9, she didn't want to wake up. Lydia knew that the other wolves in the room could probably sense the change in her heartbeat. She could feel Lev curled around her, grooming her, and every few seconds he let out a loud puff of air onto her fur. His mouth nudged itself under hers and lifted it up. Lev must have known she was awake. She finally let her eyes open and let her body relax a little once she looked around and noticed the horrible man wasn't in the room. Lev purred lowly and nudged her again, so she sighed and stood on shaky legs. His body was really warm and she never wanted to leave it. Lilia let Lev's mouth pick her up by the scruff of her neck and drop his body off of the bed. She was carried slowly back to Lev's. Lilia started to fidget in her mate's mouth. She didn't want to go back into the cold cave. A quick growl from Lev shut her up, but her body was still tensed until they reached the spot where she had passed out earlier. There was a pile of cloth. Random colored cloths filled the space, and now Lilia was fidgeting for a different reason. Lev carefully set her down and watched her run, then jump into the pile. He panicked slightly when she completely disappeared from view, only to see her head pop up with a goofy smile. Lev was scared to leave her alone again. He laid on the edge of the cloth and watched her snuggle into them. Lelia was just about to fall asleep again when she felt her mate stand up. Her ears twitched, finally catching the sound of footsteps, and she carefully stood up as well. Lev moved to stand over her so she could be slightly hidden from view. Lev, had you relaxed from training long enough? Back to work. The man crossed his arms. Though Lelia knew her mate was physically stronger than that mean man, but she didn't know if her mate knew that. Why did Lev need to train so much? This must be the reason this pack was so strong and could eliminate practically every pack in its path. Lelia began to shake when she realized just how close her and her family were to dying. She just wanted time with her mate. Why did everything have to be so complicated? Lev turned around and pushed her lightly into the pile of fabric. He covered her with a few pieces before turning to the man and following him outside of the den. At least she was warned this time. Her sleep was once again interrupted by that man a few minutes later. He walked in without Lev and her body subconsciously began to shake. Her mate wasn't here to protect her from him, and even if she howled the den was so big Leah knew it wouldn't help. She tried to cover herself up a little bit more and pretend she wasn't there. He used his foot to push her out of her comfortable spot, leaving her to roll over a few times before being able to stand up. Shift. The man. His body stance and tone of voice suggested he thought she was wasting his precious time. Lelia was thankful the man wasn't a real alpha and couldn't command her to shift now. When she didn't make any move to shift, the man pushed her with his foot again. Lelia slid back until she hit one of the walls of the den roughly. A whimper escaped her mouth, taking with it all of the breath in her body. Lelia wheezed a few times before she was able to stand. She crawled over to the cloth and dug herself underneath it. Though she was scared she'd get hurt more in her human skin, she could communicate more that way. The cloth managed to cover her skin from neck to mid, though once she'd shifted. The man growled and stepped forward to kneel next to her. "Who are you?" Lelia asked, tucking the tangled hair behind her ear. She covered up the rest of her skin with the cloth. His gaze on her body was almost making her physically ill. "I think you should answer that first, sweetheart." His grin seemed dirty and it made her feel dirty. I ask you first." Lelia wanted to smack herself as soon as she said that. The man smirked and kicked some of the cloth aside. "My name is Roman. Little girl." "Your turn." His smirk turned into an intimidating frown. Leah. Where did Lev go?" "You mean your mate?" Roman's evil smirk was back. "Who are you?" Disbelief coated her voice. She wanted to know how he had so much power over her mate. Leah just wanted to leave. "Where are you from?" Roman ignored her questions and moved closer to her. She gulped and scooted away from him a little bit. "Why do you need to know?" "My strongest warrior disappears for a week and then returns with a pup from some random pack and it turns out to be his mate." "Do you know how many of my warriors have mates?" "How many?" "None." Roman snarled. His hand gripped her hair right at her forehead and used it to tilt her head up. Her eyes filled with tears and she was really starting to regret coming with her mate. Mates were supposed to lead a lifetime of happiness. Yet Lydia had felt nothing but fear since she left her mom and Aunt Johanna. "I have done." Lydia swallowed her fear. "Nothing wrong. You've done everything wrong." He shouted and used her hair to start lifting her body in the air. Lydia let out a loud noise of distress and clutched all the cloth she could to her body. "Lev." Lydia shouted her mate's name as Roman lifted her body higher and higher into the air. Seconds later, the familiar, large, furry form that made up Lev came skidding into the room. It took him less than a second to have his jaw locked around Roman's neck. Lydia's body flopped onto the pile of cloth and she scrambled to cover her entire body with it. A dark green cloth moved over her face and she tried to take calm, deep breaths. She tried to breathe, listening to the sounds of snarling in the room, but sobs came out instead. She was alone. She was scared. and she was without clothes. Lydia just wanted to go home. Ease now. The sounds of snarling immediately stopped, and Lydia was too afraid to lift the cloth off her face. A few moments of silence passed before Lydia saw large teeth carefully lift, but she was beginning to pull her comfort cloth off her face. Lev's grumpy face greeted her teary eyes. He snarled and turned to Ronan, who was slowly getting to his face and wiping some red water off of his arms. Sadly, Lev hadn't decapitated Ronan like Lydia had hoped. She flinched and cried a little more at the disgusting thoughts filling her head. She was never leaving Lev's side around Ronan. Lev, she sniffled. Lev rubbing his wolf, white cheek against her human one while keeping an eye on Ronan. He was staring at them, hatred in his eyes, and Lydia scrambled backwards, slightly uncovering her body, and Roman's eyes quickly glanced over the exposed skin. Lev covered her body with a snarl, and she gratefully wrapped her torso around his wolf form. "Get out," she whispered to Ronan. Lev growled in agreement, nodding his head towards the entrance of his den. Now Chapter 10. "Who is he?" Yulia asked her mate, only to shake her head at herself. He wouldn't be able to tell her, so she didn't know why she'd asked. She'd ignored her mate and covered her face with the cloth once again, and pretended all of her problems went away. Just as she was calming down, Lev lifted the cloth again. She pushed it back. He moved it again. "Stop." She sat up, huffing, and glared at him. For not knowing much about mates, he knew he was in trouble. Lev let out a long whine and let his ears droop towards the back of his head. Lydia smoothed her hair back, needing to be in control of something, and moved her glare towards her legs. I just want to know what's going on, and no one will tell me. And you can't tell me. And that guy is really creepy, and..." Lev whined again, this time scooting a little bit closer to her, but she was still frowning and glaring at him. Can you, are you sure you can't shift?" Lev cocked his head to the side, then lowered it to the floor. "No." She wanted an answer out of him. "Shake your head like this for yes, and this for no." She gestured how to say yes or no with her head. He seemed to follow along, then shook his head no. Lydia visibly deflated, and he whined again. Sighing, she reached a hand towards his head. He chuffed and rubbed against her, almost knocking her over. Lydia couldn't help but laugh when she landed in the pile of cloths, blushing at the fact that she still wasn't wearing any clothes. She sifted through the colorful material and managed to find what looked like a pair of shorts that had been passed down far longer than she had been alive. They were torn and stained, but they would work. Lydia didn't find a shirt throughout the mess underneath her, so she picked up a random piece of material and held it up to Liv. He cocked his head at her in confusion again. "Open your mouth," she commanded. Liv's eyes widened, and he took a step back. "No, come here. Liv, I just need you to rip it for me." He walked over to his mate and opened his mouth, looking at the ceiling of his den while she used his teeth to rip the fabric. Soon enough, Lydia was tying the fabric around her body, covering her torso and some of her stomach. She grew cold again, so she wrapped herself back in the cloth and looked towards her mate. Lev laid down next to her a moment later. "Can I ask you some questions?" Lydia asked quietly. He nodded. "How long have you been here?" He cocked his head towards her to show he couldn't answer the question. "Oh, right," she says to herself. Yes or no questions him. It seemed like she didn't have a question to ask. She snuggled deeper into the blankets, smiling slightly when he laid closer to create more warmth. "Are your parents?" July 8th extraordinaire, Nylan Nilban. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Lev shook his head no. Lydia gulped. "Did that man kill them?" Lev nodded. Lydia let out a loud breath. A minute passed before her next question. "What is his name?" As soon as she asked the question, she realized he wouldn't be able to give an answer. "Can we leave?" The answer to that question was a very rapid no from Lev. Lydia's eyes began to water. She knew it, deep down. She knew when she left her family that she probably wouldn't be returning, but now that it was official, she felt completely helpless. A towel slipped past Lydia's eye without her permission, and Lev noticed immediately. He changed his position until he was laying on Lydia, staring at her face, his wolf eyes staring down into her own. "I really wish you could shift," she whispered, more tears streaming down her face. Lev began to whine, nudging her face until she pushed him away and rolled over, facing away from him. "It was the doctor coming into the den. We need you outside. 1 minute." Lev growled in response and the doctor quickly made his way to the exit. "Don't leave," Lydia whispered. She made no move to turn back over because she was trying to hide her fear of the strange, cruel man. Lydia never wanted to see that man again. He didn't have a choice. If he didn't leave, he would be punished, but he couldn't tell her that. He wanted to stay there, so badly, but he didn't know what was going on, or why he was so close to this woman. If he left, maybe Roman would have answers. A few seconds later, he left, ignoring the sound of sniffles coming from his den. He met Roman in the same room his mate was just in. He was laying on a bed, bandages covering his neck, and Lev found himself wincing in fear as he left the room. Roman's voice was cold, but Lev stood strong. He would take his punishment like the strong warrior he was. "You dare attack your savior?" Lev lifted his neck to the side to show his submission before rolling onto his back to beg for forgiveness. "I don't think the process room will help you, Lev. If you cannot control yourself, you do not belong as one of my warriors." Roman was threatening Lev mildly, but the wolf on the floor found his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. What punishment could it be if it was not in the process room? The process room contained all of the tools one would need to torture a human, wolf, or any other species. "Get the girl," Roman told the warrior guarding the door. He gave his leader a simple nod, then slipped out of the room. What girl did he mean? Did he mean that girl? Lev couldn't think of any other female in the compound. Shrieking sounded from down the hall and Lev scrambled to get up. "Stay," Roman commanded, and Lev found his body freezing in place. The screaming continued to get closer and closer until the warrior was throwing the female on the floor. She fell with a sob, and Lev tensed every single one of his muscles to stop from moving. "Stand up, Lydia." Lev turned his head towards Roman, scrunching up his face, confused. How did he know her name? Lydia stood on shaking legs, covering her stomach and thighs from all of the men's views. She sniffled, gruel dripping from her mouth as she sobbed, and looked at Roman Lev. Roman looked at Lev, silently commanding him to stand. "Do you remember me mentioning the word mate?" Lev chuffed in response. "Mate is short for soulmate, Lev, and I am supposed to be your lifelong partner. This girl, Leah, is your mate. You only get one of them. Do you have any feelings for her?" Lev was confused by the entire explanation. None of that made sense. Soulmate. What was a soulmate? He took a step back in confusion. The female Lelia was still crying and standing in the middle of the room. For the first time in a very long time, Lev felt like he was losing control of the wolf inside of him. He had been trained in precision and control since he was a child, and this was a foreign feeling. It didn't feel good at all. Roman seemed to be able to tell Lev was losing control, his eyes wide until they couldn't anymore and his mouth gaped open. Lev's wolf took full control, snarling at anyone and everyone in the room except for his mate. Melia stood still, shaking and crying in the middle of the room. Lev's wolf was quick to jump in front of her and let out a loud roar that had the warrior that dragged her in running from the room. Roman took a step back, Lev made a noise at the back of his throat, and strangely, Lydia understood what he meant. She shifted into her wolf form so he could pick her up, and he took her back to his den without so much as one more look at Roman. Lydia didn't shift back until they had arrived back at the pile of cloth. "Please." Still crying, "Please shift." Lev didn't know how, and he wished he could tell her, but he would probably never be able to. They spent the night in the den, Lev leaving for a few moments to hunt for food, but the mostly just getting silent. Lydia was starting to regret coming with her mate. The bond was not strengthening nor decreasing, and it was driving her mad. This wasn't how it was normally supposed to go for mates. She was supposed to be marked already, and maybe be in love, but it looked like that was never happening. Lydia sat up and rubbed her eyes, coughing a little. Lev stood and cawed around her to keep her warm but was pushed away 2 seconds later. She sniffled and pointed across the room, and without even telling him, Lev moved over and chopped down. "Shift." Lydia put as much authority into her voice as she could. "Please." Lev still didn't really understand the concept of mates and wasn't sure what she meant. He could feel his wolf begin to pace in his mind. Okay. Lydia trailed off. "I'm not going to make any sense with this, but..." She paused for what seemed like forever, and Lev moved closer until she held a hand up. "Picture your human side. I know you've never really seen it, but just picture legs. Legs like mine, arms like mine, but picture them on your body, please." At this point, Lydia didn't know if she was begging Lev or the Moon Goddess, but it would be great if both of them could help. Lev couldn't picture legs. What did that even mean? His mind stayed focused on her body, and her focused on his. Then he shook his head no. He didn't understand. For the next few nights, Lydia stayed wrapped deep within the cloths, only coming out for the necessities which included trying to get her mate to shift. That was definitely a necessity. She was trying to keep track of how much time passed in the den, but it was difficult with no windows and no way out. Weeks upon weeks passed until she made progress with her mate. After they had already eaten dinner and cuddled to lay together, she decided to try again. Focusing just on the legs and no other body part, her mate was able to transition one leg into a human limb for about 10 seconds. Lydia started crying and Lev started panicking what could be wrong. "You did it." Leaping into his arms, "We can work with this." Chapter 11. Another week passed before he was able to transition to legs at the same time. The shift still only lasted a few seconds, but it was the best few seconds of Lydia's life. His legs were very muscular and very hairy, but they were legs nonetheless. Roman almost caught them a few times, but slowly Lev was shifting quicker and quicker. Lev would do anything to see that look on her face again. He couldn't tell what the look meant, but his wolf howled when her lips stretched across her face. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." It looked like she was snarling, gnashing her teeth at him, but then she used her voice and it wasn't threatening at all. He didn't know what it meant, but his wolf liked when she did it, so he kept shifting. It confused him a lot. Shifting. Too long. Pale things stuck out of his body instead of his large furry legs, and Lev didn't think he liked it. Lydia and Lev had slowly formed a routine, and it was driving Lydia nuts. She never left Lev's den to eat, use the bathroom, anything. She knew it kept her safe, but staring at the same spot on the wall was going to make her go insane. Lev would leave very early every morning and Lydia wouldn't see him again until late. When Lev had shifted both legs, Lydia warned him and stressed that he cannot do it anywhere except with Lydia. Surprisingly, Roman had left them alone. Lydia believed he finally believed she was more powerful than him. Even if he sent his entire army after them, Lev would destroy them and not even blink. Though they were both more powerful than Ronan, Lilia couldn't figure out a way to leave the compound. It had been weeks, maybe months since they had arrived, and Lilia knew it was time to go. She missed her family, missed the outside, and missed freedom. She didn't have that here. No one had that here. It was late at night and Lev was due back any minute in face. He entered the cave just as Lilia was wondering when he was going to be back. When the low lights hit him, Lilia gasped and shot out from underneath the cloth. Lev was beaten, red watery, and limping on one of his hind legs. When she went to grab onto him, she was surprised as he took a step back and lifted his lips at her. Lilia's hand dropped to her lap and tears filled her eyes. He snarled at her again when tried to reach out, but this time, she didn't let her hands stop. His voice got louder and louder in his snarling. She tried not to flinch until her hand reached his fur, and Lev whimpered instead of snarling. "What did they do to you?" Lilia murmured quietly. She was shivering, trying to hold back the tears in her eyes as Lev continued to whisper, while he laid down. She saw the extent of his injuries on his stomach and swallowed the sob that threatened to overtake her body. Lev's fur was almost completely gone on his stomach. What was left was singed as if he was held over a fire, like a pig being roasted. When she tried to move it with her fingers to look at any injuries underneath, Lev moved back a little. The paw that he had been limping on looked broken. There was almost no way to break his leg that way naturally. Lilia couldn't imagine how painful it must have been for someone to just snap it like that. Her mate bared his teeth at her when she tried to touch his leg, so she left it alone. The fact that Lev was more like a dog while injured was scaring her. Just how much of his wolf had taken over. Instead of seeking help or what his mates thought, she was ready to bite her, because he still felt like he was in danger. That was no human instinct. She held Lev's head in her hands and looked at one of his ears that dropped, it never drooped. The top edge of his ear also looked singed, and as her eyes moved to meet his, they filled with tears again. "I can't do this," Lilia admitted aloud for the first time. She couldn't survive here, they couldn't survive here. She couldn't do this. Lev winced, eyes tired, hurt, and longing for this weak, simple human that cared for him so much. She didn't really mean it, right? Lilia couldn't leave even if she tried because of Roman, but Lev doesn't want her to go at all. He's still unsure about what exactly she is, but she can't leave. His whining continued, growing louder and louder, and a few seconds later it turned into loud howls. "Hush," Lilia whispered. His cries immediately quieted. Lilia started to cry as soon as Lev stopped. She missed her aunt, her mother. She didn't know what month it was, more or less what day it was, and it was killing Lilia inside not being able to see her mother. Lev was being too loud. Roman would come if Lev was being too loud. She shook her head and tried to gather her thoughts. "Is there a way that we can leave and they won't come after us?" Lilia was begging to whatever goddess was out there for him to say yes. Lev shook his head no. Lilia didn't want to believe him, but as the strongest warrior to ever exist, he probably knew this compound inside and out. There had to be a way out of here. She turned to Lev and grabbed his fur, making him whimper a little bit. "We need to go, Lev," Lilia said, wiping the tears from her eyes. "Or I will try to leave by myself." Lev quickly growled at her to stop her from continuing that thought. If she even tried to leave by herself, she would get killed so quickly. He couldn't handle that, but he also couldn't leave. "I'm going," she demanded. She stood on wobbly legs and took a step forward, only for Lev to grip the cloth she was using as a shirt and pull her back to plop down on the pile. She bared her human teeth at him and tried to stand up again, and again with the same result. After many attempts, she was able to take a few steps across the room. Lilia's legs ached, but she was taking it step by step. She started to falter and tripped slightly when she realized Lev wasn't following her. When she reached the door, a strange noise came from the den. Fear caused her heart to churn and her stomach to roll. but she didn't want to turn around because she knew the look in his eyes would make her stay. A loud, throaty wail came from deep within the cave. Lydia stopped so fast she tripped over her legs and fell flat on the ground. It wasn't because she was scared. It was because the voice was human. Chapter 12. Lydia rushed back into the cave the fastest she'd ever moved before. She doesn't see him at first. Her eyes search the den, landing on a lump underneath the cloths. Another wail comes out from the lump along with some movement. She swallowed, her throat trying to close up, and took a few steps closer to the lump. She stutters, swallowing again. Never the shuffling stopped. Lydia took another step. A dark brown cloth shifted, reveal unruly, greasy brown hair. He'd done it. Lydia ran towards the pile and dropped to her knees before him. She moved more pieces of cloth to uncover his face. The beard on his face reached past his shoulders and the hair on his bare chest was way overgrown, but his eyes, Lydia had never seen eyes like that before. In the darkness of the cave they glowed dark brown and squinted at her for a moment. Lev tried to sit up, but it seemed like his limbs wouldn't listen to him. It was clear that he didn't know how to move at all. Calm down. Calm down. She tried to hold his face between her hands, but he pulled away. Everything is all right. Panicked movement stopped soon after, except his eyes blinking like crazy. Lydia laughed, tears slowly slipping down onto his face. He flinched in surprise when they started hitting him. You did it. His eyes searched hers, smiling slightly when he heard her happy voice. She sniffled, tried to stop the tears from falling, and moved to sit closer to him. He moaned, frustrated that he couldn't move any of his limbs. We're gonna start with yes or no. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Let's get that arm moving. Lydia moved his arm up and down, relaxing the muscle and getting it used to the movements. She tried not to blush at the tense muscles in his arms. After about an hour, Lev was able to weakly hold up his thumb for a second. Lydia had to look quick or she'd miss it. Wait, Lydia thought aloud. Roman doesn't know you shifted. A thumb up from Lev. We need to go. Now, Lydia said angrily, only to realize that if he couldn't move any of his limbs, he couldn't do anything close to running. After only a few seconds of seeing his human form, she was going to have to help him shift back. You have to shift back in order to get us out of here, she said quietly. She thinks it's about to be sunrise. Roman would yell at Lev for training any second now. Shifting back to his wolf form was easy because he could already imagine what he looked like. Soon enough, Lev's wolf form was licking the side of her face and jumping around, happy to be moving again. Are you okay with leaving now? This isn't what life is supposed to be like, Lev. They've brainwashed you, Lydia told him. The begging in her voice hadn't gone unnoticed. Lev hadn't seen just how thin she'd gotten, and her skin wasn't even warm anymore. It was always cold. Wasn't it supposed to be warm? What was he supposed to believe? The savage wolf deep inside of him fought to be next to her instead of outside, and it concerned him. Ever since he could remember, the wolf inside of him fought to be outside of Roman's clutches. The change in his wolf's mood, the shifting, maybe it was all for a reason. Lev's gut was screaming at him to follow her, so he did. Lydia was glad that out of all of the wolves, the strongest one was her mate. Her interest was that he knew this. Compound inside and out, besides being strong enough to take on guards. She climbed on his large back with patchy fur and clutched on to what she could as Lev sniffed out into the hallway. Lydia noticed that even though her mate was the largest wolf she'd ever seen, his paws were silent. The only way she could tell they were moving was the movement of his back. The candles were lit along the corridor, so it was harder to see, but Lydia knew Lev would be able to smell a wolf long before they saw it anyway. So much had happened in the last 20 minutes that Lydia felt like she was going to pass out. She couldn't. This could be their only chance of getting out of here alive. Lydia didn't know what kind of army Roman had, but from the size of the compound, she could only assume it was huge. Lev's skin vibrated under the fur he had left as they turned into another hallway. Lydia didn't know what that meant, so she just held on tight. Her assumption was correct as her mate leapt, with her on his back, onto another wolf. Lydia had grown up extremely sheltered in the way of never seeing death, more or less fighting in general. She clenched her eyes shut and tried not to lift her hands to cover her eyes when Lev jumped at the wolf. Lydia didn't know if it was a guard or just a wolf strolling through the halls, but she couldn't help but feel guilt at the sounds she was hearing. A few moments later, they kept moving, Lev trying to keep his breath under control. A few wolves later and they were outside. They were outside. Lydia opened her clenched eyes and footed gasp at the darkness before them. They would have to rely solely on Lev's nose. She counted his steps as he moved forward. 1, 2. She counted in her head. More and more steps. Lev froze on his 23rd step. Lydia could feel his muscles tense as if he was waiting for something, and he was terrified of whatever he was waiting for. After a few moments of silence, something moved in the shadows, Lev moving along with it. A wolf leapt into the light and landed within reach of Lev and Lydia. She clenched her eyes shut and held on as tight as she possibly could. Sounds of ripping flesh and snarling filled the room till it was only Lev's heaving breath left. He began to walk slowly again after the fight. Lydia didn't unclench her eyes and hands until they were far enough away that she couldn't even smell it anymore. Unfortunately for her, she only had to wait a few minutes after that for more wolves to appear. They were clearly patrolling, guarding the area from intruders. Lydia closed her eyes and tried to think happy thoughts while ignoring the sounds and smells around her. Why were the wolves inside, when patrolling for intruders? In her old pack, they all patrolled near the border to search for unfamiliar scents. Unless these guards were to make sure no one got in or out. She shuddered at the thought of Lev living here his entire life. It was time for a change, a permanent, happy change. Lydia had no clue where they were going to go, but they just needed to get out of here fast. She scrunched up her face as her trail of thought was lost and the sounds of fighting reappeared. Maybe they could just walk until they found a pack willing to take them in, but it would be a difficult feat. Most wolves knew who her mate was and what he had done. Lydia half wished she could go home, but also how he would hold her mother and Dantigant against her. She could come up with a plan against her old pack when she found a new one that was willing to take both her and Levin. Her mother, Lydia thought about her every day as she fought to keep track of time. It was hard to, in that den, as she didn't know how much time had passed. How long did her mother have left? She was glad that Johanna was there to take care of her, but frowned at the thought of Johanna and her mother worrying every day. Lev chuffed when he was finished to let her know they would be moving. It felt like it had been weeks since they'd left Lev's den. Lydia wondered if Lev was scared at all. Over the time she had been with him, she was sure he had to be somewhat scared because everything was changing. He had lived this way for so long, but now he was trusting his mate and fighting for freedom. Lydia whimpered when more wolves came upon them. Before she was able to close her eyes, she counted the wolves coming towards them. 7. Was Lev getting tired? She wished she could help him. Lydia vowed that when they reached a new pack, she would train to be as strong as her mate for her mate. She would do it for herself too. After the fighting began, she forced herself to open her eyes and could clearly see why Ev was the best warrior in this fortress. He took down all faster than she put on clothes, and it was astounding to see. They walked for a few minutes of silence until they made a single turn that showed light at the end of the tunnel, literally. Lev started to run towards it, and Lydia almost had to close her eyes at the impact of the wind. She sat up and widened her eyes when she saw what was waiting for them at the end of the tunnel. "Liv," she nervously shouted over his paws hitting the ground. He grunted in acknowledgement before pushing himself harder. As they came closer to the light, a dark, loud chuckle resonated from what was blocking their escape. "To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Milburn, heartfelt thanks for your unfading patience, enthusiasm. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the story, please give a like, and don't forget to subscribe to get notifications for updates.